Each of us has wisdom, compassion. Each of us has a place in this world from which to serve. We each can play our part in this vast world. And when we consider ourselves, when we look at ourselves, it's essential that we see that importance, that beauty, precious nature of our presence, our birth into this world. Of course, if we do that, if we come to the point of seeing that, then we can look around and see it in each person. See the same thing. See, oh yes, each person has their place. It is in seeing that that we invite people into that experience. It's in seeing that we invite people to see themselves that way. I, as some of you know, spent a good portion of my youth as a child and as a teen very angry and hateful. We talk about the 5 hindrances. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Buddhist meditation technical structure of the 5 hindrances. The first is that we want to get things. We want things. This, of course, is very present in our society, very important to our economy. People want things, and so most of us have hundreds of times more than we need. And in fact, hundreds of times more than will make us happy. We have a lot of things. So there's that hindrance to wisdom. There's hatred and ill will. This also is very important to at least this particular country's economy, to our society. We have a lot of violence, both in many different areas, in our media, also in our personal lives, and in terms of our relationship with other countries, other cultures. We put much more of our resources into war than any other civilization, any other country right now. There's also a sense of anxiety, of worry. That's another hindrance. Can prevent us from achieving wisdom. We worry about this, worry about that. We're anxious about this, anxious about that. We sit down to practice, but all we think about is, are we practicing correctly? Sometimes we say, yes, I am, this is definitely correct. And we say, oh, no, I'm not, it's not correct. But either way, it's actually the same hindrance. There's exhaustion, tiredness. This is very significant for us, oftentimes as we practice. We feel tired, we feel drowsy, we feel slothful. Bodies enter a torpor that's very difficult to escape from. These two sides, the sense of frenetic anxiety and lax exhaustion, these two sides of the practice are very important to work through as we enter deeper and deeper states of meditation. And later meditation traditions, at least in the Buddhist, in Buddhist history, emphasize these two hindrances more and more as ways of purifying our minds of these obstructions to wisdom. Something that we often don't notice is that in the same way that covetousness, desire to get things, and hatred, the desire to hurt others, although of course it can mean hurt ourselves as well, we often don't see that these two are dependent upon each other. It's because of our desire to get things that other people become competitors. If we didn't have the desire to get things, then we wouldn't have a need to compete with each other. And it's because of the constant competition that we realize that I need to get a lot of things to protect myself. In the same way, there's a link, there's a feedback loop between anxiety and exhaustion. We often feel that if I am tired, then I need to freak myself out in order to get going again. But actually, it's that very freak out that is exhausting. And so we go back and forth from one to the other. And this is something that we can explore very carefully as we practice. This is another case, as we see so often, in which exactly the act that we perceive as resolving a problem creates it. So we sit down, let's just say, play out the example. We sit down and we fall asleep. Happens. Some of you may have experienced this. Well, maybe not. Okay, good. Well, I've experienced this. I've sat down and fallen asleep. Now the question is, why did I fall asleep? It's very important to ask this question, because for me, the typical answer that I'll give is, well, because I'm not freaking out enough. If I were really freaking out, then I wouldn't fall asleep. And so I get myself all worked up about how I'm a bad person for falling asleep, and would just be a better person, I wouldn't be falling asleep, and get myself really worried. I bring up all kind of self-centered notions, get myself excited about, quote, practicing, and then yes, I in fact do wake up. But what I don't notice is that this is continuing the feedback loop that put me into the place where I was falling asleep in the first place. And that is that I exhaust myself with freaking myself out about myself. And it's amazing how many times you can validly say the word self in this description of what's happening. I exhaust myself by freaking myself out about myself. Because it's all a circle around how am I doing. And I get really worked up, and then yes, my eyes open, at least, and I sort of practice. But I don't see that doing that is tiring. It uses up my strength, and it blocks my strength. It confirms to myself that I'm bad, that I need to be corrected and fixed, because I'm fundamentally flawed. And that robs me, saps me of my strength. Because why should I have strength if I'm so bad? I don't even think I deserve it. I shouldn't be strong, I shouldn't be empowered. And so I recreate the exhaustion by the act of escaping from it. In the same way, we may sit down and freak out. We totally freak out. I don't know what's going on. And this also very common, especially in the early days for me. When I did meditation, it was terrible. It was a terrible experience. It was pure anxiety. I didn't know how much anxiety I had in my body until I sat down, and then suddenly I saw it in full display and just wanted to run, just wanted to get away from this practice. I was telling a group, some of you have heard the story of my first time I was taught how to meditate and how bad it was. I told this story to a group, and there was a Q&A period at the end, and one of the people asked a question that indicated that she just didn't believe it. that it's not true, you're making it up to make us feel better, because you're afraid that we're having a hard time. But obviously, if you had that experience, you wouldn't have kept practicing. So I needed to go over it again and try to convince her that I really did have a hard time when I sat, and she was willing to consider it, but I don't think I successfully convinced her of my own experience. So, whether she believes it or not, whether people believe it or not, in fact, I had a very hard time. And it was a 20-minute sit, and I honestly don't know how I made it through that 20 minutes, much less the hours that you're sitting. But I've sat more hours than most of you are sitting in a day, and I don't know how I did that either. Sat for that 20 minutes, I've sat for 20 hours in a day, and I honestly have no idea how I did it. It amazes me, and I doubt, in fact, that I did it myself. So she and I are in a similar situation in a certain way. Because it was so difficult, because so much anxiety came up. Now, I was fortunate in that case that I didn't fall into the typical pattern. But a normal pattern, when that starts happening, when we're freaking out, is that we try to deaden ourselves. We just try to not experience this, try to avoid it, try to dull our experience, and we just tell ourselves, okay, just relax, just get rid of all of this. And we attempt to put ourselves into a deadened, slothful state in which we're just stuck in numbness. This is a very common human response to this kind of anxiety that comes up and feels absolutely uncontrollable. That didn't happen for me at that time, but it happens quite a bit. What we don't notice is that when we do that, when we deaden ourselves, something terrible happens. And it is that we lose the ability. We have intentionally prevented ourselves from having the ability to be aware of how precious our lives are, to see our vow, to move forward towards it. We've lost track of how terrifying it is if we don't live our vow. Terrifying for ourselves because we're not fulfilled, but terrifying for the world because it doesn't receive our gift. Because of that, because we lose that, we naturally become anxious. And it's so strange. I've lived in a lot of different places, and I can tell you that in a lot of the world, people just assume that Americans, that people who live in the United States, are utterly stress-free. Which is very reasonable, actually, if you consider it. You're all rich, you're well educated, you don't have any country that could beat you in a war. You have very little terrorism in your country, virtually none. Very little crime. The police are extremely trustworthy relative to other places. You haven't had a civil war in generations. On and on. They say you have plenty of jobs, and the environment is actually relatively clean. How could you be stressed? There's no source of stress in your life. Compared to us, anyway, where there's a lot of stress. We have a reason to be stressed out. But they just assume. I have to, again, explain to them, and they don't always believe me, that Americans also experience stress. And that actually, studies indicate that Americans experience more stress than many places where a lot of these problems are rampant. Why? Why would that be? What's going on? In my experience with this path, it seems that a good portion of it is that we are really not living our vows. And if you want a source of stress, avoid what you know is true. Fight against who you are and your purpose in the world, because that's fighting against God. And while fighting against a rebel group is hard, fighting against God, I mean, at least you might win against the rebel group. But you're not going to win the fight against God, the fight against yourself, the fight against your own nature. It won't happen. You're going to lose. And as Robert Thurman, an amazing Buddhist scholar at Columbia, has said, most of us live a life of a battle between me and nature, which I will inevitably lose. That's our life. And that is a source of stress. I and the way things are in conflict. And we know, I'm going to lose this one. And we continue to fight it. How do we find ourselves in this battle against nature, God, truth, ourselves? Because we've deadened ourselves. We've numbed ourselves, turned ourselves off. Because of that, we've lost track of the way things are. We've lost track of ourselves. We've lost track of our hearts. Because we've lost track of it, we're off. And we have to try to catch up somehow. So we freak ourselves out and try to make ourselves get back on. But because we're freaking ourselves out, we can't handle it. And so we deaden ourselves. And since we're dead, we can't keep up with the way things are. So we have to freak ourselves out. And in this way, this positive feedback loop continues, and we're not able to live our vow. Strangely, what that means is that we live lives that are profoundly boring. I know a lot of people think that you live in a monastery like this and you sit around all day and all you do is look at the floor or the back of your eyelids, and it must not be interesting. A lot of people ask me about this. How can you, what is it like to live in a monastery? It must be so boring. And my summary of what it's like to live in a monastery is, it's the same as life, just more. It's the same as the life you live, just more of everything. That's it. Just everything's more. And that's not boring. So I remember one time, soon after leaving the monastery to come back to the United States, early on, I'd been in a monastery for a few years, I think, and I was leaving, and I was in Seoul airport. I had flown from Japan to Seoul, and then I was going from Seoul back to this country, and I was in Seoul airport, and Seoul airport's very international, probably where I was anyway. Less than half of the people were Korean. And I was looking around at a world of people. Here are all these people from all over the place. And walking around in an environment that's hyper-stimulating. Lots of lights and lots of objects that you can buy and lots of different kinds of food. And I sat down and I was sort of looking around. And the one thing that there was one word that came in my mind that could, of course there are many different words you can use to describe all of that. But the one word that was most dominant was bored. Everyone just looked bored. It was incredible. Like, people, you have so much stimulation. This is, and you're late for your plane. There's a lot of problems and a lot of stuff happening, but your face just looks bored. And there's a reason that people look bored. That is that's boring. That's why. What was happening was utterly boring. It might seem as if I have to make my flight. It's, 500 meters that way, because it's a huge airport. I have to get there, but there's no time. I don't even know where it is. Maybe that seems exciting. It's not. It's boring. That's not a problem that any of us were born to solve. It's shockingly boring. And that's amazing when something can be so boring that it's shocking. But we weren't born to do that. On the contrary, to sit down and actually transcend ourselves, to sacrifice ourselves, to cut through everything that we most believe, to risk our lives as we're doing here, because that's what we're doing. If you're here, you're risking your life. Everything you think is about to fall away from, you're going to lose all that. Everything you think you are, you're going to find out you're not. Everything that you believed you're going to do with your life, you're going to realize you don't care about it. All of that, your whole life is about to be sacrificed. You're about to lose everything you've ever wanted. That's exciting. That's fascinating. That's incredible. That's the hero's journey. This journey of needing to deal with problem after problem that you can't possibly deal with, and you don't know where it's going, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. You really don't. It's not like the flight. Maybe you'll miss that flight. You just get another one. Maybe it'll cost you $400 or something, but who cares? But this you care about, because the person who's doing it, you're not losing a few $100s. You're losing the person who owns the few $100s. And how do you ever get that back? It's not like money that you can just get back. When you lose this, the person who loses it is lost. So who gets it back? This is exciting. This is incredible. And that's the reason that Harada Roshi says that most of the time when people fall asleep in meditation, it's because, in fact, they're bored. They just never noticed because they spent all day long freaking themselves out about things that they don't care about. But when you sit down and learn even a little bit how to stop freaking yourself out about what you don't care about, you will immediately fall asleep, because the layer underneath the frenetic freak out about what you don't care about is boredom. Now, good news, you can get through that, and there are much nicer layers as you go down. But typically you have to go through anxiety and then boredom. You have to notice how they feed into each other in order to get down to a deeper level in which wisdom can emerge. And for the first time, we can start to realize, this is what is to be done. Finally, of the hindrances, there's doubt. There's doubt about things that we don't actually doubt. There's arbitrary philosophical conversation that we continue in our minds, and we say, would this really work, and why would it work, and how would it work, and should it work, and maybe it shouldn't work. And we can go on and on in the wilderness of views, doubting this and doubting that, with the constant demand that first I must understand, and then I will do. Once I understand it all, then I will do it. Only once I understand it will I do it. But it doesn't work that way, of course. We first experience it, and then our minds follow along and just accept it, accept reality more than understand reality. In any case, for me, the most significant hindrance was anger. I spent a long time in anger, very mad. That was the hindrance. Different people have issues with different of these hindrances. Maybe you yourself, you can consider, well, for me, which of these 5 hindrances is the big one? Is the one that I revert to when I'm not sure how things should be going, when I'm confused or weak or vulnerable, which is the one I go to. And even though to you it may seem as if the one you go to is the obvious one, other people may not. Other people may have other tendencies. So for me, anyway, it was anger, hatred, scorn. And I lived by that for many years. I didn't just experience it, I really lived by it. I trusted it with my life, and I did what it told me to do. And how can that be broken? How could that be broken for me? It was broken because I met someone who, upon meeting me, could really see me and really love me in one moment, simultaneously, to be really seen in a way that most of us, as we walk around the airport, we don't see anything, much less each other. Most of us don't see in this way, but someone who'd practiced seeing, who'd practiced listening, who'd practiced knowing for decades, someone who could truly see me, and who'd practiced loving, practiced accepting, practiced honoring for decades, who could really love me. And at that moment, of being seen and loved. There was just no place for the anger to stand. It's like it was marching along confidently for decades, and then there was just a hole in the ground, and it just tumbled in. It just lost its footing. It just lost its footing. I don't know how else to say it. The thing that supported it wasn't there. What supported it? Ignorance, aversion, clinging, not being seen and loved, even by myself. And once my self-hatred fell down, lost its footing, was lost, the same happened. There was no foundation on which, there was no material with which to build up hatred for others. And so it was so strange because the patterns that had been moving for decades, they actually kept turning, but there was nothing feeding them. The metaphor that's given in modern times is very nice, even though I guess we don't use this technology so much anymore. But one of the most important technologies of world history, the most important inventions of world history, was the record player. It's hard for us maybe to imagine now how significant it was as an invention. But radio and the record player were very, very powerful in changing the way we understand our lives to what us for now is normal. We record things, you see, all the time. We don't even think about it. But the record player is very important, and once the record player made its way into Buddhist countries, it's a device that it's just a turntable. Yes, it's turning a little disc, and you put the record on that, and then it can make sound. But in any case, there's an electric device. You can plug it in, and the turntable turns. And the Buddhist masters saw that. And they saw a perfect metaphor for how our minds work, for how the mind of hatred and ignorance works. Because they could see there's a cycle, and it's not going anywhere. It just turns and turns and turns and turns and turns, which is just like our minds. It's just turning and turning and turning. But that cycle, and then on top of that cycle, all kinds of things can be played. All sorts of different sounds can be played, and we get really excited about all the sound. Say, well, I like this record, and I like that record, and I like this band, and you don't like it, and so you have bad taste, and we get into arguments about it. But the thing is that the record actually isn't the point, because you can take all of those records off. You see how well this metaphor works? It was really exciting when they found this little device for the metaphor. So all the records can come off. That's very interesting. But typically, before we even notice that we took one off, we were already thinking about the one we're going to put on. So we don't notice what it sounds like when you take it off, but before you put the next one on. Many people never notice that. But it does sound like something. It does. There's a word for it even. We'll get to that. So, take it off, take it off. And then you see this basic churning pattern. And yet that pattern can't just keep going on its own. It has to be plugged in. It has to be fed by something. If it's not fed, it will end. This is what we were talking about yesterday. If you don't feed the fire, if you don't continually feed it, it will go out. You must feed it. This is something that we should all see clearly, especially nowadays when our whole lives are based on cell phones. And we've noticed the battery will run out. Phone won't work anymore. See, I brought my example of this so that you could see this is a phone. And if I don't plug this in regularly, it becomes worthless. It won't work at all. And there's no way to make it work. It cannot make calls if there's no energy in it. It can't. No matter how you shake it, no matter how you yell at it, it still won't work at all. And that may seem so obvious that it's not even worth considering. But sometime when you lose your phone charger, you'll start to realize how important this fact is. that you really need to feed it. And if you don't feed it, it doesn't work. In the same way, they noticed if that plug isn't plugged in, this won't work. But the final part of the metaphor, which is very useful, is that let's say it's turning. There it is turning. The records are off of it and it's turning. It's just turning. Turntable is turning. And you unplug it. What happens? And the answer is, it keeps turning. It does. You can try this sometime if you ever find one of these. You unplug it. It'll keep turning. And then slowly stop. It's just the same with this practice. We're practicing, we're practicing, we're practicing. The insight that we have is the insight of unplugging it. That's the insight. It doesn't mean it stops, though. It then takes time. It can take a whole lifetime, actually, for our patterns to become purified and come into accordance with the unplugging of the record player. But once it has come into accordance with that, and this is very important as well, no matter what record you put on it, it'll sound the same. Doesn't matter what record you put on it, once it's stopped, it'll sound exactly the same. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that incredible? Doesn't matter what record you put on. You can put 2 or 3 records on at the same time, and it'll still sound exactly the same. You could put a sounds of nature on it, and it'll sound the same. If you put a music band on it, it'll sound the same. No matter what happens, it'll sound exactly the same. Won't it? Right? There will be no difference in how it sounds. It'll continue to sound precisely the same, whatever record you put on it. It'll be the sound of silence. It'll be pure silence. You put another record on, listen. Okay? Yep. Again and again, you'll see it's just the same. So, my experience of it was that it was as if the hatred had been unplugged. It wasn't that the patterns ended. There were still a lot of patterns. But it was unplugged. And when it's unplugged, you know where it's going. There's only one direction it can go from that point. It has to slow down and stop. And that's deeply relieving. Gradually things will come into accordance with having been known and seen, and having removed the feeding of these hindrances. It's our job as we practice to first and foremost learn how to know and love, learn how to see and love. That whatever comes up, we see it just as it is, and we accept it, we love it, we receive it just as it is. We practice that, and as we practice that, we come to see the wisdom that's already functioning in us, that we would never have seen if we weren't willing to see how things are really and accept them really. As long as we were fighting with them to try to make them right, we'll never find the wisdom that's already right. This is another example of causality happening in a way we don't understand. We continually think that if I manipulate my mind enough, it'll be right finally. It's totally different from not manipulating our minds and finding out how it's already right, how it already didn't need to be manipulated. But as we practice that and we see it, then we can accept. We can know who we are. We can accept who we are. We can love who we are. Having done that, then we can see that same beauty in each person. We can find our place. We can start to live our vow. We can see that same beauty, that same miracle in each person, and each, actually not just human being, of course, but each living thing that is actually seen. Some of you were around when Josh, my friend, was saying that he's an engineer, and he likes working with tangible things. He said it's really fun. He gets to create little devices and sell them, and there's a problem, and there's a tangible solution. And he said that he doesn't have the sense that spirituality is like that. But I would say that spirituality, in fact, is more like that. This is actually more tangible. If you see that beauty in someone, it's more tangible than their physical body. You will see it more clearly. Consider how clearly you can see a person's body if you look at them. It's more than that. And some of you have some people here have actually started to experience what it's like when this joy and grace starts to emerge in your own body. And you know, it's tangible. It's like a substance. It really is. It's like a substance, like warm honey or something. It's not some abstract possibility. It is a real, tangible experience that's as real as touching an object like this. As things become that tangible, that clear, then we can start to actually use that to make decisions. Because we can use it to make decisions, we begin to live a life that's a demonstration of our vow. And because of that, we're in a position to connect with each person at that same level, so that the hindrances within us, the hindrances within others, lose their footing. This is the opportunity we have. This is what we've come here to do, and it's what is happening. The way to do it is very simple. Continue clearly with a technique, without any gaps, without any vacillation. Continue with it, continue with it, continue with it, and trust that each thing that comes up is the next, quote, person who needs to be seen and loved.